To start today, your work in school safety comes from a very deeply personal place. So, as much as you're comfortable, could you just explain to our audience what led you to where you are today?
Sure. For those that, thank you for having me, first of all, Cory. So let me get it a little closer. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. And I'm not trying to curry favor with the audience or whatever, but I got a chance to drive around a little bit around here. What a beautiful area, beautiful state. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I was telling Cory, when I got off the plane, it was a little chilly. It felt like February in Florida. But anyway, unfortunately, I'm here because of a tragedy. So I think most of you are familiar with the school shooting that happened in Parkland, Florida in 2018. My daughter, Elena, was sitting in her freshman English classroom when an attacker decided to enter the school and walked in through an unlocked gate, through an unlocked door, and then began to randomly shoot at anyone that he could see. And unfortunately, at that time in Florida, we didn't lock doors, we didn't lock gates, we didn't have clear policies about who could contact law enforcement. And so this intruder got onto the campus and started attacking the students and teachers at the school. And my daughter, unfortunately, was in his view, along with 3 other students in the classroom that she was in, and she died that day. And boy, there's lots of ways you could respond to that. I certainly started out as angry, as you might imagine, frustrated, a million questions. What happened? Why did this happen? How could this happen to me? Right? A lot of personal. Why did this happen to me, my daughter, my family? But I also, my daughter was inspirational to me on a number of fronts, not the least of which is I like to say she was a little bit of my conscience for the first 14 years that she lived with us. I cannot tell you how many times I heard the, "Oh, Papa," kind of comment from her when I would do something she thought was a little bit off. Cory may have to do that today if I get out of line, but Elena did that for me, and as my conscience, I've decided that this phase of my life is going to be about trying to prevent what happened to my family at my daughter's school from happening to other families. Unfortunately, we keep hearing about tragedies. There was one here in Wisconsin not too long ago. We'll talk about that. The positive news, is I tend to want to be a positive guy. I'm an entrepreneur by background in technology, so I have to be optimistic. Otherwise, I just quit and go work for somebody else. I believe we can get through this contagion that's going on around our country, and we can get through this and we can prevent these tragedies. And we're going to talk about how a little bit about how you can do that in your role in preventing school violence.
Thank you. It's never easy, I'm sure, for you to talk about that, and it's heartbreaking to hear about it. I want to turn right away to what happened here in Wisconsin at the Abundant Life Christian School. And I'm curious in your thoughts about if you're a school leader, if you're a school board member, what kind of conversations should you be having in the aftermath? What kind of discussions should individuals be thinking about? You can talk about policy or whatever else it might be.
Sure. I woke up this morning and the Abundant Life Christian School shooting is in the news again this morning. I don't know if any of you saw that, but I think the father has been charged today with providing access to the weapons that his daughter used. And the sort of outside the policy realm in this room, but it's something legislatures around the country are considering, prosecutors are considering, is the responsibility we as adults have for allowing our kids to have access to firearms. sounds like it was against the law here in Wisconsin already. It's a felony in Florida. We take it very seriously. And so there are consequences. And I will just tell you, as a firearms owner, I'm actually a licensed firearms dealer. I am about as pro-Second Amendment as you can get. If it helps you understand, I just wrote a piece for the Federalist about the Second Amendment. I write for Bearing Arms. I am not anti-gun. You're not going to hear any of my solutions today talk about gun control as a solution. But I do think as parents and as gun owners, we do have a responsibility to make sure that those firearms are secured in a way that no one has access to them that we don't know about, right? That to me is common sense. I was, in preparation for this, I was going through what Wisconsin, I was looking at your Department of Justice site and your AG's site. Your Office of School Safety seems to be housed there. In Florida, it's at the Department of Education, but here it's the Department of Justice, which is fine, doesn't really matter where it is, within certain boundaries, and we'll talk about accountability. It was one of the things I want to talk about. But one of the things that I noticed, that there's a bunch of resources on this website that talk about school safety. In fact, there's a whole section on it. And so the first thing I would just say is I would commend each of you as school board members to make sure you go to that Department of Justice website and understand your responsibility. So around school safety planning, as an example, but Wisconsin Statute 118.07 is really the heart of your responsibilities as educators and as school board members. And it addresses a few things. So one is you must have developed and implemented a school safety plan for each building and regularly occupied building by students. These plans must include and be reviewed and approved every 3 years by the board. But they must address emergency prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So I want to talk about those things specifically, and Cory and I will get into this a little bit, but as board members, you're responsible for, I want you to remember these things. Prevention, there's mitigation, there's the response and recovery. Prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery. But these plans have to include various procedures for emergencies such as school violence, bomb threats, fires, hazardous weather, and intruders. So these are all things that you should do. These are turned in every 3 years, and it's a requirement in statute that you do it. I don't know if any of you how many of you are current serving board members? A number of you. I won't ask this question because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I don't know, have all of you read your school safety plans? We got some hands. That's good. Your name's on those plans. You turn those into the state and you sign off as a board member that you understand those plans and you agree with those plans. That's a pretty serious responsibility if you think about it. Putting your name on a plan that is going to be executed by staff in your districts that could and should save lives. If it doesn't, the public's going to come back to you and look for you for answers. And we won't do this here, but I've done this in smaller groups before. But I've asked school board members to prepare, and a lot of, I've had some pushback on this one, but might be a worthwhile exercise. Prepare the notes for a press conference after a school shooting in one of your districts or in your district. Just as a thought exercise, prepare your press conference. What you would say to the media, to the parents, to the other members of the community, the educators. What you would say if something happened and you hadn't done everything in your responsibility as a school board member to make sure that doesn't happen. These plans, by the way, have to be developed in consultation with law enforcement, including a on-site safety assessment. Law enforcement, now contrary to popular belief among many educators, Law enforcement is not the enemy. Are there bad cops? Sure. Are there bad school resource officers? Yes. We've all seen the videos, right? But in general, educators are not security professionals. They're not security experts. Nobody expects you to be. But you should be consulting and working with and collaborating with those that are. Parkland, as I sat on the commission that investigated Parkland, what we saw there was a failure of government. It wasn't a failure of gun control, wasn't a failure of social media. There are all these contributing factors, but the failure in Parkland was that the school district knew that this kid was a threat. Law enforcement knew he was a threat, and the mental health community, right, knew he was a threat. None of them shared information that they had. And I'd like to think that if they had communicated with each other, if the school district had known that the sheriff's office had been to his home 42 times, if the mental health providers knew that law enforcement had been there 42 times, the mental health providers in the county were at his home almost on a daily basis because of violent outbursts. He was attacking and assaulting his mother, and they would come. He kicked his mother's teeth in one time. He could have been arrested for that. But the mental health providers did not share that information with law enforcement. Neither of those entities talked to the school. There was a culture, one of our head of Florida law enforcement calls them cylinders of excellence. We call them silos of information. You know, these are entities that for whatever reason have decided that they won't share information with each other, and there's some really good excuses, right? You've all heard of FERPA. Any of you other board members were probably briefed on FERPA by your general counsel. I can tell you, after listening to experts come in and talk to the commission about FERPA, FERPA does not prevent you from sharing information about imminent threats to your schools or to your teachers or to your students. And by the way, the Department of Education, to my knowledge, has never gone after a school district for sharing information. It is more often than not used by your general counsel or other board members as an excuse to not communicate and collaborate with other governmental agencies like law enforcement or mental health providers. So first piece of advice, push back on your general counsel on FERPA, and I think Will can probably help you with that if you need guidance. I'm not an attorney, I'll just put that. I'm not an attorney, but I do know that you can share a lot more information. To that point, you're going to get tired of hearing about Florida, and I apologize, because I hate going to other states and talking about everything we've done, but we've done some good things. One thing that we did was that we separate disciplinary records from the educational records. FERPA particularly covers the students' academic records, and I'm generalizing a little bit because, like I said, I'm not an attorney, but we keep disciplinary records in a separate system that is not, our Attorney General and everybody has said is not subject to FERPA. I don't know if you can do that at your district level. I don't know if your Attorney General would sanction that, but I can tell you it's incredibly valuable because we use that as part of our prevention efforts in something called behavioral threat assessment and management. And I'm going to take a pause, I promise. But behavioral threat assessment and management is something you do here in Wisconsin. Have you all heard that term before? BTAM, behavioral threat, you have it, okay. So on that same Attorney General's website is a whole section on behavioral threat assessment and management. Wisconsin has worked with the United States Secret Service to create this capability which allows for educators, law enforcement, mental health professionals to come together in what's called a behavioral threat assessment team and evaluate threats that are threats to schools. BTAM is the methodology used by the Secret Service to protect the president. The reason that it's important for schools to understand, or the way it got to schools, is that Secret Service realized that a lot of these school attackers share many of the same characteristics as assassins. So as they started to study school violence after Columbine, they said, hey, the things that we're doing to protect the President of the United States could actually be used to protect schools and churches and other entities. So the important thing there is you all should be very familiar with BTAM, and I'll keep plugging this as we go on. But behavioral threat assessment and management is the tool that we use in Florida, and we've prevented over a dozen school attacks post-Parkland because of BTAM. 90% of these school attackers share their intentions with somebody else. That's called leakage. That leakage comes into that behavioral threat team, and that behavioral threat team can then use that information to, depending on the stage of the threat or the seriousness or the imminence of the threat, that information can be used to prevent that school attack. We've done it a number of times in Florida. And maybe I should pause.
You don't need to pause because I'm sure this is very valuable information, but I will follow up with something related to what you were just sharing. 2 parts. First, is it true that most of these types of attacks are conducted by individuals who generally have permission to be on campus? They know the routine, they know the layout, and if so, how do we confront that reality? And then this goes to your point about risk management. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, great point. So a couple things. So, locking doors in classrooms and locking doors on your buildings is an important element. But to Cory's point, a lot of these attackers have permission to be there. The Abundant Life attacker had permission to be on campus. She was a student, so she came in through the door. It's still important, I would say, to lock your classrooms and know who's on your campus. You'll hear vendors talk about metal detectors and all these kinds of things. Occasionally, they can be helpful. I don't want to dissuade you from trying different things, but metal detectors in and of themselves will not prevent this kind of tragedy because these insiders, these kids know how to work around the system. The school attack that just happened in Texas, a student let the attacker in through another doorway that was locked. He came in, he would have bypassed the metal detectors. They wouldn't have caught it. To that point, this is why behavioral threat management is so important. This is why, and you've got a reporting app also, and I've forgotten the name. I apologize, but there's a reporting app. It's so important to get that information to those behavioral threat management teams that can take action, particularly getting it into the hands of law enforcement who can take definitive action and investigate a potential threat. So important to do that because these kids do have permission to be there, and just locking the doors or just having a single point of entry into your school campuses or putting a perimeter fence around your campuses like we do in Florida, it's not sufficient to keep that attacker off. Can I talk about another deterrent? I believe some schools optionally here have school resource officers. I don't think it's required in Wisconsin. At least I couldn't find that it's required. There doesn't seem to be a pushback against having school resource officers, but we have armed security on every campus in every school in the state of Florida. Every public school has this, and most of our private schools have chosen to do that too because they've now gotten into competition with each other to try to have the safest private school. So they try to one-up each other to attract students. But on the public side, we've done something that at first in Florida was very controversial. A lot of parents didn't like it. Educators didn't like it. It didn't seem like anybody was for this, but we created what's called the Guardian Program. And we hire, retired law enforcement, retired military, and teachers and other education staff can go through the Guardian Program. It's an intensive It's 96 hours of training. I've been through the training. It's phenomenal, including firearms training. And those guardians they're undercover, I guess you would say. They are concealed. The weapons are concealed. And we have multiple of guardians on school campuses in Florida. It is a deterrent. It means to an attacker that school is not a soft target. It is not a target that if they do choose to attack a school, they're going to meet resistance, and they're going to meet it very quickly. And the Guardian program, when I say it was controversial, we heard every possible thing that was going to go wrong. Negligent discharges, kids were going to get the guns, the teachers wouldn't want to participate. It turns out none of the things the naysayers were saying about the Guardian program were in fact true. It has been an unmitigated success. I can count on one hand in 7 years the number of sort of issues we've had. We've had two, I think, negligent discharges in the entire, there's thousands of guardians across the state of Florida, and we have 4,000 schools. We've had two, they both happened at home. They weren't around the kids. No child has had access to the gun. The program has been an absolute unmitigated success in my view, and it's really, when you look at some of the averted attacks that were planned against Florida schools, you can see these attackers in their manifestos and in their writings talk about having to modify their plans. They were actually looking at other targets. And if you remember the attack in Nashville, the shooter there, she was initially going to go to a shopping mall and another school. I think she had two targets selected. Thought she would get resistance at the mall from security guards, and then chose a school, the school that she went to, the Covenant School, because she knew there was no armed security, she wouldn't meet resistance. So that has been an incredibly important element to keep the attackers away from our schools. They're just simply, Florida schools are not soft targets.
Yeah, on that point, I'll just note, perhaps some of you know that Will recently litigated a case involving school resource officers, because we do have a state law passed not long ago that required a school resource officer in Milwaukee Public Schools in at least 25 of the schools in that district. And the school board simply wasn't complying with that law. So there was some resistance to having law enforcement in the schools, and we actually represented a parent of a child in Milwaukee Public Schools who, and we can get into some of the data too about if schools are disruptive, how that impacts the other children and how safe or not safe they feel. But thankfully that lawsuit was successful, and now there are school resource officers back in Milwaukee Public Schools. But on that topic, the topic of the school culture, school resource officers, classroom management, if we could just turn to, I know you're a wealth of knowledge on this topic, what should school board members be looking for when we hear things like climate and culture? What does that really mean?
So during COVID and during what some of us affectionately call the Summer of Love, there was a big push to defund police across the country, right? And as part of that, there were 20 groups that got together. Now, these are all sort of variations on a theme. This is how the left works, is they all, it's this self-referential thing where they create one group and then another group, and then that group cites the first group, and then the third group cites the other two, and they put all this information out, which was basically just bogus research that they had done, that students felt unsafe, particularly minority students felt unsafe with school resource officers on campus. In reality, when you look at the only sort of peer-reviewed sort of good research that I've ever seen on this has been done by a gentleman named Professor Dewey Cornell from the University of Virginia, and he surveyed students and minority students, and found just the opposite. He found that they actually feel safer knowing that there's a school resource officer. And when you look at the role the school resource officer plays, yes, they're there for safety. Yes, they're there as a deterrent. There's also some really positive, the whole program got started because law enforcement wanted to build good relationships with youth as they were growing up. And so to that end, and when they do a good job of putting good school resource officers in our schools, it has just a positive effect all around. The problems come in when discipline and sort of law enforcement, when the lines are blurred. My concern reading through what I saw today was on the DOJ site, there's a lot of sort of what I would call pre-Parkland, Florida language in there. There's some good stuff, but there's a whole lot of terms in there like social emotional learning, restorative justice. I'm not clear. I can't tell where your discipline policy starts and stops, and where law enforcement starts, or where your discipline stops and law enforcement starts. Those need to be bright lines, and as much as you can as a school board member, you've got to make sure that those lines, what you're responsible for as the educational institution as far as discipline, that's your job. You set those policies, you work with the students and the educators and the parents, you're responsible for that. But when somebody breaks the law on the campus, a consultation with law enforcement should be the next step, right? Again, our legislature in Florida had to pass a law to force school districts to do this because they wouldn't do it on their own. They would not do it on their own. And so now they don't have the discretion. If a crime is committed on a campus in Florida, consultation with law enforcement has to happen. It would be great if you could force that to happen at the district level. But it may require you getting together and working with your legislature, and hopefully your governor would sign something like this, but just to get together and say, we need this line to be, we don't want it blurred. Because what happened in Parkland that most people don't understand is that the school district stopped enforcing much of its discipline policy and stopped arresting students that were committing crimes on campus because of an Obama administration directive. And a letter that was sent, a Dear Colleague letter it's called. And this came from, it was a combination of DOJ and the Department of Ed. And it was sort of the carrot and the stick. And what the Department of Education told Broward County Schools was, we've noticed that you disparately discipline minority students versus white students. And we think this is a problem, and you need to fix this. Or the DOJ is going to come in, the Office of Civil Rights, and investigate you. And no school district wants an investigation, right? They don't want that. So what happened in Broward County, where Parkland is they hired a superintendent. He was he had worked for Arnie Duncan, who was the new Secretary of Education for Obama. Came from Chicago Public Schools, and he was brought in specifically not to make the school, not to make it an A school district or to improve academic performance or any of the things that I think most parents would think a superintendent's job is. He was brought in specifically to fix this problem because they didn't want an investigation from the Office of Civil Rights of the DOJ. So he created something called the Promise Program. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Sounds great. The Promise Program was really a community relations effort and a couple of PowerPoints where the superintendent went around and told everybody that he was going to solve this problem, and he was going to collaborate with the state attorney, and he would collaborate with the sheriff and other local law enforcement agencies, and they would get to the bottom of this and they would fix it. The agreement in the background was simply with the sheriff in that district. The agreement was to simply stop arresting juveniles for committing crimes. That's really what they did. They came back the next year. Juvenile arrests in the district had gone down by 53%, just magically. They said, hey, this program's working. Well, we found out on the commission that it wasn't in fact a program. It was, like I said, a community relations effort, because the killer at Parkland was sent to the Promise program. But they didn't even take attendance records. They couldn't even produce attendance records because they weren't keeping track of who was in the program and who was not in the program. And if I told you the parameters for the program, it would probably make you angry. But you had to commit the same infraction 3 times before, and I'm not talking just I'm talking crime. You had to commit the same crime, like a sexual assault on a campus. You had to do that 3 times before law enforcement would get involved. If you did a sexual assault, some vandalism, and then physically assaulted a teacher, those were 3 different things, and so you were diverted into this Promise program. And so that was the environment in Broward County where this kid that was showing violent tendencies and had attacked another student for the first time in kindergarten. That was the environment in which the kind of tragedy that Parkland became was allowed to fester. I can't think of a terrible word, but I can't think of a better word to describe what it was. The teachers union, right after Parkland, surveyed their members to find out what they thought, because they wanted to contribute to the investigation, the conversation that was going on in the community. 59% of the teachers in the county felt unsafe in their classrooms, felt like they couldn't teach because they were worried about being physically assaulted or attacked in the classroom. So can you imagine, when we talk about safe learning environments, which is the question, right, or whatever, the left wants to call these things, you've got to feel safe to have an environment where you can learn. Our teachers need to feel safe so they can teach. If those things aren't happening, if disruptions are a constant problem in your classrooms and you're not dealing effectively with the disciplinary issues that you've got, and you're afraid that the state or the federal government's going to come in and investigate you because you're trying to maintain some kind of classroom environment where students can thrive, look, that's the kind of environment that breeds the chaos that leads to a Parkland or any of the other number of other attacks that have happened around the country. So a bright line on discipline, referrals to law enforcement for things that are crimes, and don't guess at what a crime is, or don't let your administrators sort of guess at what criminal activity is. Consult with law enforcement. They're the experts on that. They'll determine whether or not a crime has been committed, and then they'll refer it to the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system, where that will all get adjudicated, right? That's not your job to sort of say, well, Timmy didn't mean to, punch his teacher or whatever, right? So, yeah.
I want to emphasize too that, and I'm sure you've seen this, President Trump issued an executive order just a few weeks ago. So this pervasive methodology I should say, pressure that had been in place for years to discipline children differently based on their race or meet certain racial quotas in terms of which students are being suspended or disciplined, that is no longer acceptable. President Trump, it was an executive order on student discipline in particular, and is really devoted to restoring order to the classroom, so that teachers feel safe and that kids can learn. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A, and it's a follow-up to our keynote on cell phones. I would like to hear your thoughts if parents push back, say, well, I really want access to my child, or what if there's an emergency? How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah, great question. So as she was speaking, wonderful presentation, I thought, but as she was speaking, I was wondering if we did it right or not in Florida, because our legislature just kind of banned cell phones from schools. Look, I will tell you, from a school safety perspective, and hopefully this would help you in conversations with parents. There is absolutely, I've listened to hundreds of hours of cell phone recordings and watched the videos from inside the school on the day of the attack. There was absolutely zero value to responding law enforcement. There was absolutely zero value to those kids having, I mean, the 911 system was overwhelmed with phone calls. And we had another problem there with landline phones going to one law enforcement agency and mobile phones going to a different one. So there was other chaos that was created because of that. Things like Alyssa's Law. Alyssa was the young lady that was in the classroom with my daughter, and her family has fought for these panic alerts. They're badges that teachers can wear, and educators can wear, and staff can wear, where you can simply push a button. It knows where you are in the building, and depending on, if you push it once or 3 times or whatever, you can summon help. Teachers are using this in Florida sometimes with disruptive students. They can press it once and bring school administrators to the classroom and get help, or teachers that are around them can come help them. I don't remember, I'm making it up, but 3 times means there's an active shooter or something like that. So that is far more helpful for response, to take seconds off of response and save lives than kids having a cell phone in the class. And just as an observation, now that I sit on the State Board of Education, I think more than just about school safety, the benefit to our kids of not having those screens in front of them, and not, like, we're not seeing, we used to see videos at the Office of Safe Schools. They get videos almost on a daily basis of fights that were going on in schools, and the kids would all record them, and we're not seeing those anymore. And we're studying to see whether or not we've had the incidents of fighting have gone down, but I think there's probably a little bit of a deterrent effect with the students not being able to record it. Sometimes it just doesn't happen, because a lot of it gets built up for social media likes and clicks and things like that. So, but as far as school safety goes, you can reassure your parents with something like an Alyssa's alert capability, where staff can call a lockdown or implement a lockdown quickly and get law enforcement the information they need. That is 1,000 times more effective than kids having phones in the classroom and calling 911, and they're scared, and the information that they're providing is not particularly helpful to law enforcement. It was, quite frankly, it didn't save any lives in Parkland. It did probably aid in the investigation a little bit as to what happened. But you've got surveillance cameras for that in most of your schools.